Do you think he was a real person?
Most of the scholars I've talked to say he probably was. The evidence is not great, of course, but I don't think it's that big a deal, actually, because a wandering preacher called Yeshua or Yehoshua would not be surprising. I mean, it's a common name,
Right.
and there are plenty of wandering preachers. What would be very surprising would be if he raised Lazarus from the dead and walked on water and turned water into wine. And that, of course, did not happen. And the point I'm making is that it's a very big difference to say, did he exist? That's very different from saying that a miracle worker who really did do miracles rather than conjuring tricks existed.
Yes.
There isn't a single eyewitness account of Jesus' life.
Okay, but this is not ridiculous or surprising to historians. First, a case can be made by arguing from scholars like Craig Keener or Richard Bauckham that the Gospels of Matthew and John were eyewitness accounts, and the Gospels of Mark and Luke were based on reports from eyewitnesses.
I mean, sometimes people say, oh, you have a Christian bias. Well, look, I've worked through all these ancient sources, and it looks to me like the people who don't want to accept at least the basic claims of the New Testament are working with an anti-Christian bias. I mean, the best surviving source on Alexander the Great, who lived 356 to 320, is from Arrian, a historian who lived in the 2nd century AD. So he lived like over 400 years after Alexander died. And yet the Gospel of Mark, the usual critical dating of the Gospel of Mark is only 40 years after Jesus rose from the dead. So, I mean, we're talking about a much shorter time frame, much closer to the time of the eyewitnesses.
The standard scholarly view of how the traditions about Jesus reached the evangelists when they were writing their Gospels is the view that form criticism proposed early in the 20th century. And the view is that the eyewitnesses who heard Jesus speak, who saw the events of his life, presumably started the traditions off. But then there began a whole process of these traditions passing through the oral traditions of the early Christian communities until eventually they were tapped by the evangelists. And during that process, of course, anything could happen. And there have been different ways of reading it. Some people managed to read it in a fairly conservative way, as though the tradition preserved the traditions pretty well. But the form critics and the real disciples of the form critics tend not to think that, because they stress that the communities and the oral tradition was not really interested in history. So they have no real motive for preserving traditions about Jesus accurately. Their motives are much more to adapt and add to and kind of create freely traditions about Jesus and add them to the traditions. And that's why, on the form critical view, you need, if you are going to say something about the historical Jesus, you need criteria to distinguish authentic material in the Gospels from inauthentic material. And that's the way a whole lot of Gospel scholarship has gone.
Tonight, we're going to try this approach to arguing that might help us move past scoffing at the other side, whatever the other side is for you, and then move past being furious and move us all maybe into being curious.
I'm excited to be talking about the 6 years of my life dealing with that, and to talk about why both the public and experts in the field need to take this more seriously and explore this alternative view of Christian origins. It deserves a place along with all the other diverse contradictory theories that have been proposed within the field.
Thank you very much for that. Jonathan?
Thanks, Brandon. So I used to think I knew who Jesus was. I was moderately well-read, but I was wrong. A lot of things I missed. About 10 years ago, I started editing Wikipedia when my late wife was really sick and I needed a distraction. And so I got on the Jesus page, and I ended up reading the top scholars in the field, Bart Ehrman, Geza Vermes, E.P. Sanders, J.D. Crossan, Gerd Tyson, and I found out all sorts of stuff that I had been wrong about and that I didn't know about. It was all really interesting to me. Jesus has a remarkable life story. His ministry was really interesting. His teachings are sort of paradoxical. There's a lot of mystery around him, so it's an interesting topic. I'm excited to be able to share with you sort of what historians know about Jesus and what a lot of things that people sort of assume or think they know are wrong. And hopefully by the end of the evening, you'll know more about what historians say about this guy.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming out. It's a lively crowd, I can tell. So this is definitely an unusual experience for me. Just a second, let me get my timer going. Don't want Matt yelling at me. Right, this is an unusual experience for me. I do a number of debates, but normally I'm debating an evangelical Christian or a fundamentalist about something of interest to fundamentalists, such as whether the Bible, the Gospels are completely accurate or not, or whether the historian can prove that Jesus was raised from the dead. Normally when I do these debates, I do them in front of a large fundamentalist or conservative evangelical audience. So the last one I did was in the Deep South, and there were like 600 people there. And I started out the debate by, we were debating on, I don't know what we were debating on, the resurrection or something. And so we started out the debate, and I asked the audience, I said, so how many of you in here consider yourselves committed Christians? Boom, everybody raises their hand. I said, okay, how many of you are convinced that Jesus was physically raised from the dead? Boom, everybody raises their hand. Okay, how many of you are here to see me get creamed? Boom, everybody raises their hand. Oh my God. So, yeah, that's my normal experience. So,
yeah, I think E.P. Sanders is probably the most important scholarly figure for the development of New Testament studies of the last 100 years. And this is true whether you study Paul, whether you work on the Gospels, whether you study historical Jesus, or study ancient Judaism. It's not that other people haven't made hugely important contributions. I'm not talking about his personal character or anything like that. If you just look at the way his publications in all of these different areas have radically changed the trajectory of New Testament studies, I think it's undeniable that E.P. Sanders is like the most important figure for doing this.
Tom, tell us about the historical Jesus. What can we know with any fair confidence that he probably actually did and he probably actually said? Because I wanted to divide those into two things, because, I mean, there's good reasons to think why someone might die.
Yeah.
The actions. But also, can we be confident in things that he said? And if so, how do we know? Can you tell us about the historical Jesus?
Yeah, and I'm going now for the basic. Okay, that Jesus did exist. There's a consensus of scholarship on that, and I think they're absolutely right. I am not sure anyone could so successfully fake a person like that, and I don't know why they bother doing it, to be honest with you. So no, I think Tacitus talks about Christians trying to explain who they were and goes back to Jesus. So does Josephus. Jesus existed. Okay. The second surest thing we know about him, I would say, was that he was crucified. Again, from Tacitus and Josephus, he was crucified under Tiberius by Pilate. And they also notice that he was not, his followers weren't rounded up. And that tells me, if that's all I had, that from the Roman point of view, this guy was not a violent rebel, or there'd be at least 12 crosses up there, but he was a non-violent rebel. He was seditious in the Roman point of view. He was alarming the people, he was what we would call an activist. Not just talking, but activism is on that dangerous cusp between violence and non-violence. So he was an activist, and that's exactly what I would expect Rome to do with an activist. You crucify the leader, that'll finish his movement. Tacitus and Josephus kind of wonder why the movement continued and give their own explanations. Now, go back to his life. I think the surest thing we could say about Jesus, it was he talked about the kingdom of God. Let me get rid of that term, God's rule on earth. That's what it means. Kingdom is kind of an old-fashioned word, I know, a male word. So let's talk about God's rule. What would this world be like if God sat on Caesar's throne, we would say? What if God was actually running the world? We might put it in American lingo and say, what if God drew up the federal budget? What would it look like? What would the priorities be? That's the religio-political meaning of the term God's rule on earth we're talking about. And you can see the political implications of that, of course. Now, how do I know that? In the enemies of Jesus, his enemies, who looked at John the Baptist and Jesus and would have considered both of them weirdos, dangerous weirdos maybe, agreed that John fasted and Jesus feasted. They got that. Now, they call them names, but I'm leaving out the names. You fast in preparation for something that's coming. Advent or Lent in the Christian calendar. You feast in celebration of something that has arrived. I take that as a very fair analysis of the difference. John, very much like most of the tradition, is saying, the kingdom of God, God's rule on earth is coming soon. That's the apocalyptic revelation. That it's not just coming in days to come at the end of time. It's coming soon. If you don't have any announcement about soon, keep your day job in the first century. Jesus is saying, as I understand it, Jesus is saying it's already here.
What are the sources regarding Christianity? And some of you might be even asking, Nabil, why should I even believe Jesus is real? Why should I ever even believe that he's a man who existed? The first thing I'm going to start off by telling you is that it is incontrovertible, according to the historical principles of investigation, that a man named Jesus existed in the first century. How do we know this? We have over 40 records of Jesus' life from ancient times, describing this man who is essentially a carpenter in Palestine. He didn't have much of anything. He wasn't a centrally important figure at the time, yet we have 40 sources that refer to him. You know who the emperor was at Jesus' time? Someone shout it out. Tiberius. Good. Tiberius was the emperor of Rome at that time. Now, this is a man who obviously we should have a lot written about. We can expect tons and tons of records about this man, can't we? The historical records contain Tiberius' name by 10 different individuals. That's it. 10 for Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, 40 for Jesus. You can see we have excellent reason to believe that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, lived and existed in the first century. And that's why very, very few, in fact, I could probably count it on one hand, actually, I know of two, scholars who study the historical Jesus actually claim that Jesus never existed, and one of them is Bob Price.
Do you think there was a real Jesus?
There might have been a real Jesus. It's certainly a reasonable hypothesis, but it seems to me not the most likely one. There are a lot of oddities in the record and a lot of similarities between the Jesus story and those of the myths of adjacent cultures at the time. And the whole life story of Jesus is parallel to what's called the mythic hero archetype. All the things that happen, divine annunciation, miraculous conception, child prodigy episode, later on the miracles, the demon exorcisms, etc., changing water into wine and so on, and gaining a huge following, which then turns on him. He gets killed on a hilltop. I mean, this is the standard thing that happens with him too. There is confusion as to where he's buried, and also with Moses and Elijah and so on. And there's post-mortem appearances and an ascension into heaven. I mean, how many times? The question is, did this occur several times, or did it occur even once? It seems to me once you see the type of story we're dealing with here, you really have the burden of proof on your shoulders to show that this one instance was historically real. And then that might be perceived as kind of a deductive approach, but I don't think it is, because it suddenly makes sense of the fact that virtually every episode in the Gospels can be understood quite easily, even compellingly, as a rewrite of some Old Testament story of David, Moses, Joshua, Elijah, and so on, sometimes in the same words from the Greek translation of the Old Testament that the early Christians used. When you look at the teaching ascribed to Jesus, what is not almost, well, let's say what isn't explicit Christian theology, like in the Gospel of John. Almost the whole thing is that. The ethical teaching of Jesus parallels often verbatim sayings ascribed to the rabbis or to contemporary Stoics and Cynics. And in these literatures also, you have sayings attributed to several different people, as if nobody could keep straight who had said it and just figured, well, this would fit if Socrates or Diogenes or Jesus said it, and so voila, he did. So I like to say that though there may have been a historical Jesus, there isn't one anymore. We don't know if or who or what he was like. And you can see this especially comparing the shelves full of historical Jesus books by critical scholars who think that, oh yeah, a lot of it's myth and legend and secondary embellishment, but when you whittle it down to the real core of it, Jesus was like this. But it's anybody's guess as to what the core of the tradition is, if there is one, and I tend to think there is not. But the point is that with all of these scholarly attempts, it's an embarrassment of riches. Jesus can't have been all these different figures, so which one, if any, was he?
And I saw you, and my fundamentalist self couldn't stand you. I did the same thing with Dr. Bob, Robert M. Price. I said, this guy, and he's debating William Lane Craig, and I was like, Craig won, yeah. And it's crazy how much one's mind can change when they actually start opening up their mind and stop being in a narrow box. I left the fundamentalist ideas. I started seeing parallels to paganism and other worldviews, and I said, at first, my deconstruction was God's bigger. God's bigger than just Jesus. And then it was like, hold on. Jesus is in all these other... Well, it can't be just Jesus because these predate him. And then I started saying, well, God's in all of it, right? Then I started deconstructing from there. It was a good gradual deconstruction. Some people have the aha and their whole life just crumbles. I had a gradual deconstruction. So that was thanks to guys like you who pointed out obvious things and were not afraid to say what you think.
Several years ago, I was speaking on a major Canadian university campus on the existence of God. And after my talk, one slightly irate student wrote on her comment card, I was with you until you got to the stuff about Jesus. God is not the Christian God. I find that this attitude is all too prevalent today. Most people are happy to agree that God exists, but in our pluralistic society, it's become politically incorrect to think that God has decisively revealed himself in Jesus. What justification can Christians offer, in contrast to Hindus, Jews, or Muslims, for thinking that the Christian God is real? Well, the answer of the New Testament to that question is clear: the resurrection of Jesus. The Apostle Paul declared, God will judge the world by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Acts 17:31. The resurrection is God's vindication of Jesus' radical personal claims to divine authority.
The year is 2011. The greatest find in modern biblical history has just been discovered. A manuscript containing texts from the Gospel of Mark, dating to the same century as Jesus' life, was discovered inside of a papier-mâché mummy mask. If the dating of it proved correct, this would be the oldest piece of any gospel ever found. So excited were its curators that they couldn't wait to announce it in the most professional, peer-reviewed academic journal imaginable: Twitter. This was, after all, the holy grail of biblical scholarship, a piece of the Gospels from the 1st century CE, given that the next oldest known fragment still in existence dates to significantly later in the 2nd century. The hype was so high that even extremely well-respected Bible scholars like Dr. Daniel Wallace couldn't help but prematurely tote this discovery in the middle of a scholarly debate to prove the unchanging reliability of the New Testament.
The oldest manuscript of the New Testament is now a fragment from Mark's Gospel that is from the 1st century. How accurate is the dating? Well, my source is a papyrologist who worked on this manuscript, a man whose reputation is unimpeachable. Many consider him to be the best papyrologist on the planet. His reputation is on the line with this dating, and he knows it, but he is certain that this manuscript was from the 1st century.
Checkmate atheists. News publications left and right ran with the story. Christians finally had the best proof ever for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Or did they? Well, no one would say exactly how large the fragment was. Was it a verse, an entire chapter, a full gospel? Who knew? In fact, the owners of the manuscript wouldn't even reveal how they knew it was definitively 1st century, or where it was located, or whether any other experts had had the chance to examine it and corroborate the date. But surely all of that would soon change.
Many months later. Much, much later. One eternity later.
Another year went by. Still no publication. Apparently the text had been sold off to the Green family, better known as the owners of Hobby Lobby, the same family who got in trouble for purchasing thousands of illegally smuggled artifacts from Egypt and Iraq, and who also fell for forged versions of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's another story. Several more years went by. Still no publication. And yet, this entire time, every time a curious person like myself would Google for the oldest known gospel manuscript, honestly trying to figure out just how historically reliable the New Testament was, we would get page after page touting this allegedly 1st century copy of Mark, albeit unpublished and unavailable for any kind of scrutiny. Scott Carroll, the former curator for the Green Collection, continued to boast about this manuscript, which remained behind lock and key. As late as 2016, 5 years after the announcement of this still unpublished manuscript, Scott Carroll continued to weaponize it, slamming skeptical scholars since, after all, he had in his possession a gospel manuscript dating to the same century as Jesus.
Now, this is my opinion, the oldest ever discovered. Yeah. Textbooks will change with this discovery. And when this hits the media, you will hear about it. Yes, you will. It'll be on every program.
But in 2017, when the Museum of the Bible opened, notoriously missing from the Green Collection was the 1st century Mark manuscript. It wasn't until the following year, after almost 7 years of hype since the initial tweet announcement, that the results were finally published. And the papyrus contained nothing more than tiny, partial fragments of just 4 verses. And they didn't date to the 1st century, but to the late 2nd or early 3rd. It didn't come from inside a mummy mask either, but had been taken from the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus collection at Oxford's Sackler Library. But even without a 1st century New Testament manuscript, were Christians really back at square one? Did they really need a 1st century gospel to prove the historicity of Jesus and the reliability of Scripture? Well, not according to Gary Habermas or Daniel Wallace, 2 of the top Bible scholars in the world.
Okay, I posted about this on my Facebook page, and I said, yeah, I'm doing this interview with Dr. Gary Habermas, and he's writing a book that's about to be 5,000 pages long. And that's about right. And people thought that was a typo. So let's talk about the actual
500 would be long enough, wouldn't it? Yeah. Yeah, and you know, what's crazy is of my 40-something books, exactly half of them are on the resurrection. So people might think, oh, well, I get it. He's taken those 20-some books on the resurrection, putting them together, removing the duplication, and that's all the pages. But actually, so far, at 4,300 pages, only about 10% of the material is repeat of anything I've done before. So it's mostly new material. Yeah, and it's...
And would you say that's
a lot?
That's the thing that sort of separates this book from all your others? And any other book on the resurrection, well, right? Because it's all new material.
Well, yeah, and I'm answering some questions and treating some subjects, as far as I know, are not treated anywhere in print in any book.
Do you have an example of one of those things?
Yeah, here's some examples. Okay. I spent 150 pages on 19th century German liberalism, which is the heyday of naturalistic theories against the resurrection. So I spent 150 pages on what they taught, what theories were favored, which ones were not. Okay, that's the liberals. Okay, now what about when liberals went against other liberals? Because strangely enough, they didn't just say, well, he takes that, I take hallucination. They'll say, well, he's a loser because his theory's wrong. Mine's hallucination, of course, I'm right. And the next guy comes along and says, I'm wrong. So I'd make 3 moves. Here's the guys and the theories they take. Here's the liberal response, calling these guys losers, everyone but theirs. And then I have a response of major conservative scholars at that time. And these guys taught that conservatives are not like the kind we might think of today. These guys are from Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Harvard, Yale, and they're writing and saying, you're all wrong, naturalistic theories are wrong. So 150 pages on the birth of naturalistic theories and how critics go after each one. Now that's different than me taking the individual theories and giving critiques of each one. I'm not doing hallucinations per se. I'm just doing kind of a history of those theories for those years. So that's one example. Got 150 pages on David Hume and the argument against miracles, 80 pages of defense of the crucifixion alone. How do we know Jesus died? Why do almost no scholars, specialists, dispute the crucifixion? Why does John Donne of the Cross and Marcus Borg say it's basically the strongest, most readily defensible fact in the ancient world? What's some of the data? So those are some of the separate things. Oh, here's another one. Some people who give evidences for the empty tomb. If you get an article, and I can name them, but the articles, I know one article that gives 8 evidences for the empty tomb, according to critical methodology, or another one gives about 10. I've got 22 evidences for the empty tomb, all critically derived, not like, well, this verse says, all critically derived verses. So there's a lot of surprises. I'll give you one more. I do a minimal facts argument, and I use basically 6 minimal facts. Well, the 2 criteria I use is that I won't use a fact that's not multiply evidenced from a bunch of different sources. And secondly, because of that, the vast majority of scholars in the 90-something percentile allow its historicity. Well, everybody grabs onto this one. Everybody concedes it. And I'm almost never asked, how do you know these facts are true? So I put a list together. And if you count all the individual pieces of data that accredit these 6, it's over 100. Over 100, here's the key, critically ascertained facts that the critics would agree to. That's why the critics don't disallow the facts. We're playing their game.
There are many myths about Jesus. In these programs, we're talking to some experts who can help us get at the facts behind the myths. Skeptical scholars used to believe that the Bible's accounts of Jesus were written long after he lived, maybe in the 2nd century, by people who didn't know about the real Jesus. Professor Dan Wallace is one of the world's leading experts on the handwritten copies of the Bible's accounts. Here, he explains how the discovery of the earliest copy of one of these accounts overturned the ideas of scholars, and showed that the accounts had been written much earlier than they thought.
Perhaps the oldest fragment is papyrus number 52, also known as John Rylands papyrus number 457, and this is housed at the John Rylands Library of Manchester University in England. It was discovered in 1934 by C.H. Roberts, who was a man recently doctored, got his PhD in papyrology and in classics, and he was rummaging around in the library of the John Rylands and discovered this fragment that is no larger than the palm of my hand, 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches. And the interesting thing about this fragment was it was written on both sides. What that told him almost immediately, it was probably a Christian fragment. The reason is, if it's written on both sides, then it would have been written on a codex, which is our modern book form, invented at the end of the 1st century AD. A codex where you bind it on one side, then you have cut pages that you flip, as opposed to the roll or the scroll that all other books at the time had been written on. And so this is written on both sides. And John 18:31 through 33 was on one side, John 18:37 and 38 on the other. 90 years earlier than when C.H. Roberts discovered this fragment, in 1844 in the journal The Tübinger Jahrbuch, F.C. Bauer of Tübingen University had argued that John's Gospel cannot be dated any earlier than AD 160, and most likely was to be dated about AD 170. He was basing this on philosophical constructs that he had learned from his professor of philosophy, Hegel, who had come up with Hegelian dialectic, which we may know as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so through a convoluted philosophical construct, Bauer argued John's Gospel can't be dated any earlier than 160 and probably 170. And through that approach of bringing Hegelian dialectic into New Testament studies, what happened was European scholar after European scholar for the next 90 years started to late date the Gospel of John. Obviously, if it's in the second half of the 2nd century, then it has no eyewitness credibility to it, and so its historical reliability was completely dashed. But then when Roberts discovers this small fragment, he gets it published in 1935 after he had sent photographs of it to the 3 leading papyrologists in Europe at the time. Each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript cannot be dated any later than AD 150 and should be dated closer to AD 100. A fourth demurred. He said, no, I think this should be dated in the 90s of the 1st century. So you have these scholars who are saying the copy of John's Gospel can't be dated later than 150. It's probably closer to 100. Typically, we date that at about 125 now, but really it's a date between 100 and 150. But here's the interesting thing. Generally speaking, a copy of a manuscript is not written before the original of the document. This sent 2 tons of European scholarship to the flames and brought John's Gospel back into the 1st century. And with that and the Dead Sea Scrolls and some other things that have occurred in the last few decades, now we're beginning to see that John's Gospel has historical credibility.
Throughout history, humans have many stories discussing various supposed humans and other beings that we dismissed as legend as a matter of course. Perhaps no source of such legendary figures is more robust than figures related to various religions, with basically no one today, for example, thinking that Hercules ever actually existed, despite the countless and sometimes rather detailed tales of his various adventures passed down through history. But while few, if anyone today, still worships the gods and demigods of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, there are still many centuries-old religions that have survived today, who have figures that at least those who followed the religions take for granted really did exist. This brings us to the subject of today. Did the founder of one of the most significant religions in human history, Jesus of Nazareth, actually exist? And if so, what do we definitively know about what he did or said? As the first question, yes, unequivocally. As Jesus was an incredibly popular name in the region around the time Jesus was said to have walked the earth, Jesus of Nazareth definitely existed. That's like saying, did John from New York exist? Yes, New York John exists. He's a nice guy, makes great pizza. But that's not very interesting. So, what about the Jesus of Nazareth? Well, while it might come as something of a surprise to some, for reasons we'll get into momentarily, historians, from atheist to agnostic to Jewish to Christian, pretty much all universally agree that the Jesus described in the New Testament did in fact exist, and even that it's extremely likely that at minimum a couple of key significant elements of his life as described in the New Testament also very likely did happen, which we'll get into at the tail end of this video. As archaeologist and historian Dr. Byron McCain of the Atlantic University of Florida states, I do not know, nor have I heard of, any trained historian or archaeologist who has doubts about his existence. That said, that's not to say there aren't many people out there who don't agree. For example, a 2015 poll in Britain surveying around 4,000 people found that a whopping 40% of them did not believe that Jesus ever existed. But going back to historians, Professor Emeritus of Jewish Studies and Archaeology at Duke University, Dr. Eric Myers, concludes with Dr. McCain chiming in, I don't know any mainstream scholar who doubts the historicity of Jesus. The details have been debated for centuries, but no one who is serious doubts that he's a historical figure. Those who deny the existence of Jesus are like the deniers of climate change. End quote.
Looking at the history of humanity, there are a lot of people who could be considered significant and to have impacted the world to various degrees. But I think very few people can stack up to the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. At least in hindsight, and assuming that he existed, he must be considered one of the most famous people who have ever lived, and one to have had an enormous impact on the world and its culture and history, at least symbolically. He's a central figure to some of the largest and most influential religions in the world, including, of course, Christianity, Islam, and the Baha'i faith. But Jesus can also be quite an elusive figure. And different people often tend to have very different ideas and views about who he was, if he was, and what he stood for. It is a greatly debated topic among historians today as well, and of course there's disagreement here too. But it is, of course, a very interesting subject and will be the main theme for our discussion in this video. Who was Jesus of Nazareth?
Was the founding of Christianity nothing more than a mushroom-induced hallucination? That's a really weird question, but let's talk about it. You may have never heard about this before, but there's a book out there called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross that claims that the founding of Christianity was due to a gigantic misunderstanding. That the stories in the New Testament were originally just psychedelic mushroom experiences combined with ancient fertility rituals. And this study used ancient linguistics, philology, and word analysis to try to verify that theory. Now, I know that sounds absolutely crazy, but would it surprise you that the author of this particular book, John Marco Allegro, was one of the key scholars who originally worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls? You could be asking, Wes, why bother addressing this topic? Well, the reason I chose to make this particular video and not talk on some other topic is that this book and theory is constantly talked about by the famous podcast host Joe Rogan.
Connections between ancient religions and psychedelics, like any of the John Marco Allegro stuff. John Marco Allegro, author of The Sacred Mushroom and the Scroll. Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, where John Marco Allegro alleged that the entire Christian religion was essentially a misunderstanding, and it was really all about the consumption of these psychedelic mushrooms and fertility rituals, and that these were all sort of captured in stories and tales and parables.
Yeah.
The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
Yeah.
Did you read it? The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth as well?
From Allegro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know about that guy, John Marco Allegro? Do you know who he is?
No.
He's the guy who deciphered the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, okay.
He worked on the panel for 14 years, and he wrote a seriously controversial book. And the second book was the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Christian Myth. And the first one was the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
While you may or may not be an avid listener of Joe Rogan, it is nonetheless his podcast, the most downloaded podcast on the internet, with nearly 200 million downloads a month. It doesn't take much for Rogan to popularize something, even a crazy theory found in a book published 50 years ago. And believe it or not, I see people bringing this theory up on the internet occasionally. I get asked about it because people encounter it and they don't know what to think of it. And when they try to dismiss it and then find out that the origins are by a legitimate scholar and archaeologist and Dead Sea Scroll expert, it sometimes throws them for a loop. So let me explain what's going on here. Well, first, let's talk about what Allegro argued, and then let's talk about why it just doesn't work. Because throughout Allegro's work and his publications, he connected the development of language to the development of religious narratives and rituals. He used etymology, which is the study of the origin of words, and connected particular important words in the Bible and a few other ancient religions to hallucinogenic experiences from plants. And based on this, he came to the conclusion that Jesus did not exist, the Gospels were a hoax, and that what Christianity eventually turned into was nothing more than the misunderstanding of ancient fertility cults in which the object of worship was a psychedelic mushroom. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that no scholar from any background, religious or secular, either in Allegro's day or now, accepts Allegro's theories and his conclusions. Now, just because a theory is fringe doesn't mean it's false, but when nobody else in the world of academia is on your side, you should at least raise flags. Or at least for non-experts like us, it should raise flags. And there are good reasons why Allegro's work never gained any notoriety or attention from fellow researchers. Part of the problem with a lot of Allegro's books on the subject is that they require the reader to have a working knowledge of ancient languages, like Sumerian and other Semitic languages, alongside some cursory biblical scholarship. This is a tall order for anyone, experts or otherwise, and if you try to read Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, you end up wading through a lot of jargon and linguistics that may make your eyes glaze over. They made mine glaze over, and I'm actually interested in this stuff.
Which, of course, brings us right back to the question of Mithraism and the slaying of the bull. So you get this stuff all wrapped around, and it reconnects, and then, but again, the whole idea is you have to study the symbolism and learn the meaning of the separate symbols, and then you can start trying to extract the higher dimensions of meaning that emerge once you start associating the various elements. So does that make sense?
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
So does that, who was asked the question? Oh, about the Eleusinian mysteries.
Right.
Right. And the symbolism can also be encoded in the form of, mythical stories.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be visual. It can be, it can just simply be part of a story, a mythical story. And of course, the stories, the epic poetry that has come down from those bygone ages is tremendously potent in terms of the symbolism that can be extracted. And of course, the thing is that they work in tandem. So, when you look at certain imagery and graphics that might come out of the mystery tradition in one form or another, and then you read the sacred literature that goes along with it, oftentimes the sacred literature provides the key to making those first connections that you can resolve the cipher. I mean, it's pretty much the process of decipherment. It's like solving a cryptogram in a way. And you have to find some meanings first and then try fitting them together. And then, you can usually tell when you get a meaningful relationship, when you put two pieces together, just like I put these words together. Now, see, we could look at what I just did with the word apocalypse. Well, the next level, of course, is that we have arrangements, higher degree ordered arrangements of letters that create words, but now those words have to be arranged into a certain pattern, or otherwise you reach a dead end and it's meaningless on that level. And it goes up, of course, then the words become meaningful sentences. Sentences then have to be joined. In the way you arrange sentences, if I went through a great novel and I just pulled sentences out at random, and then we just mixed them all up and then rearranged them at random, again, what happens to the meaning of the story? It's gone. But the whole point is you have these successive levels of meaning. You solve it on one level. Then once you've figured out, you figured out one symbol and you make that substitution, right? It becomes easier and easier the further you go into it. It's just like, if you're trying to, what do they call it? An anagram, when the words are scrambled, or you have some substitution and you would go through, for example, that the letter E is the most frequently used letter in English, right? So what you do is you go through and you go, okay, I'm counting, and this symbol here recurs more than any other. So that might be an E. And then you work your way through it just like that. And at the end, suddenly, bingo, you get a realistic, it's just like when you're filling in the blanks, what's the television game where you have the blanks and letters go up, and then whoever's the Wheel of Fortune. Yeah, it's like the Wheel of Fortune. See, at some point, you put one in, you haven't assembled the entire word, right? But you've got enough up there. Maybe it's half of the symbols up there, and then you suddenly can see the rest. So now you go back and you've got more information, and you can go back into the other words, substitute, and eventually that's how you work your way through and fill it out, figure it out. It's really no different, the process whereby you accept. The difference is the levels of meaning, the depths of meaning that emerge when you begin this decipherment process of the sacred writings and the sacred symbols. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that if we were looking for some criteria to define what would constitute a sacred writing, it would be that. It would be that there is these deeper layers of meaning concealed within it.
So there you go. That's what people know about Jesus. That's what we've got. After 2,000 years, that's what we've got. On one hand, you have mainstream scholars. And the best they can figure is there was probably a guy named Jesus or Yeshua, or why don't we just quit kicking this around and just say There was a Joshua in Palestine, and he attracted too much attention, and he was killed. Okay. As you can see, that's not my opinion. And then you have Christian Bible scholars, and they say there was a guy named Joshua. Within 100 years of his life, people were writing his story. He was kicking around Palestine, drew attention, and got killed. The end. And what you have is a bunch of people reading a bunch of other people, quoting people, and worried about whether or not they quoted them properly. And so therefore they're quoting quoters who are quoting. But then at the end, as crazy as this sounds, I gave you two seemingly insane rantings. One says Jesus was a mushroom. Now, I did warn you. The problem is, a lot of times it seems like if you listen to a scholar, 9 times out of 10, they've turned atheist. And I kind of get that. To be honest with you, I see how you can, but then they end up in weird. Now they're into mushrooms and and we'll get into this, but if you spend too much time in religion, you're going to end up tripping balls and seeing sevens. It'll make sense eventually. It always ends up in the mushroom talk. It always ends up in psychedelics. But then you have Randall Carlson. And I hate to say it. I don't hate to say it. He sounded like the most rational person there. And if you didn't think that, well, you're probably dogmatically tied to some kind of craziness. I don't know if I've said this here before. I'm going to say it again. If I had to put a name on this age, whatever this age is, the last 2,000 years, the Jesus time, I would call this age the literal age. That's true of scholars, that's true of Christians, that's true, everything is literal. So even your historians are looking for literal guys named Jesus. And your believers say the Bible is 100% literal, and everybody's literal. And if you even veer from that, then you're called a mythicist. And some of these Bible scholars are mythicists. But I show you all this to show you exactly where the edge of it is. So I don't know if you've noticed, but I started with a couple of guys. They said, here are some experts. I then found as many of those experts who had video clips. I didn't always play the meat and potatoes. I played things that I wanted to play, but I wasn't trying to play gotcha. I was trying to show you their faces and build the story from beginning to end. I don't think I cut anything out. The general consensus is there was a guy, his name was Jesus, and he died. Some people say, and he rose again. But what none of those people said is that there's evidence of any of the things he did. There's no evidence of any of the things he did, supposedly, in the story. By anybody. The mushroom guy, at least he's an original thinker. The rest of them aren't even having thoughts. They're just whining about documentation. So I'm going to give you my opinion. Everybody else has an opinion. Most of them don't even have an opinion. And I want you to notice that. Most people aren't. They're just trying to prove or disprove a thing. They're not actually contributing. Randall Carlson said, the story is the precursor for a truly spiritual manuscript, and it's incumbent upon the reader to peel back the layers of that manuscript to get to the true meanings hidden inside of there. Jesus, in the book, said over and over again, I'm hiding the meaning. I'm speaking in parables so you don't understand me. There's a deeper meaning. I don't want you to know the meaning. If you knew the meaning, you would believe me, and I don't want you to believe me. He didn't want you to know the meaning, because you might believe him. That's huge. Holy cow, that's huge. So here's my 2 cents. Here's my opinion. Here's my deeply researched original thought. And I've been saying this in all the videos that, you know, if anybody would watch them, I think they would see it. But hey, it is what it is. Men are nations. Women are beliefs, usually in the form of religion. Which men? All men. Jesus, whether divine or not, we're not even having that conversation. They're not having that conversation. We're simply having the conversation of, was Jesus a real person? Was he a man? No, I'm going to say, no, Jesus was not a person. But neither was anybody else in the Bible. However, if men are countries, Jesus was a country. A very specific country. And I want to say one more thing. It almost appears to me that especially believers, especially Christians, so I'm talking to Christians, you talk about the Word of God, the literal interpretation of the Bible. And I'm talking to you about doing your homework asking questions and discovering things, right? So part of the mystery is you have to do the work. But Christianity is sold as kind of a turnkey thing. There's no work required. You don't need to learn anything. You don't even, in fact, the more you know, the worse it is. It's like they're selling ignorance. I'm not sure which God you're following, but pretty sure free will means not blind obedience. That would be the opposite of free will, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure free will requires you to hold up your end and only believe things that you freely and openly understand. For example, and this is a big contention, because I'm basically going to say, everybody you just watched, let me back that up. I'm nobody. In this world, I'm nothing. I have no status. I have no clout. I'm not important in any way. I'm not at the bottom. I'm not at the top. If there was a middle, I'm the middle of the middle. There's nothing spectacular about me. But my opinions are mine, and my thoughts are mine. Maybe they come from my mediocrity. Maybe they come from my middleness. But they're my mediocre thoughts. They're nobody else's. I think they're quite profound thoughts, but whatever, right? In the Bible, I've read it, so this is where I was going, is it appears that most Christians wait for a good sermon. They look at their wife or their husband and say, that was a good sermon. And then they go watch some football. And that's it. They don't know anything at all. They have never cracked the Bible. That's not true. It appears that the number of people that have studied it, that have put the work in, is painfully small. I knew it was going to be bad, but it's almost demoralizingly bad. I thought surely some people know some things. And I'm not sure where all the people that know things are, but I don't know where they are. I just see people that don't know anything and are very proud of themselves. You just watch people that know things, and they're very proud of knowing things, and good for them, they put in a lot of work. A ton of work, right? So every one of those people is an expert. Every one of those people has devoted their life to this thing. So it's no small matter, and it's no small insult to every single one of them when I, Mr. Nobody, say, all of you are wrong. All of you. And then I look at every person who believes this story and I say, you're all wrong too. And then I look at all the people who disbelieve this story and I say, you're all wrong as well. In fact, I look at everybody in the whole world from my mediocre perch of nothingness, from my throne of nothingness. And I say, you're all wrong. It's not your fault. You're all wrong. Except, ironically, Mushroom Guy has some hope of... Well, let me rephrase that. You're all right. You're all wrong. But mostly you're all wrong. Nowhere in the Bible does it say Jesus was born in the 1st century AD. It is written in a way that assumes Jesus is written in the 1st century AD, but it never says that. It's very interesting. It never says a whole lot of things that you think it said. In addition to not diving in on your own, most people don't actually hear the words that are spoken to them. They hear words, but they don't hear the words. Jesus tells you everything you need to know about how to find him. And when all of this, I looked around and I thought, well, surely there's like a couple of crackpots somewhere that have done this and everybody just dismissed them as insane. And there's not even crackpots, which means how do I put this without insulting an insane amount of people? There's been an unbelievable con job pulled on humanity. An unbelievable con job. It's ongoing and profound. I like it, the scale of it. You almost, somebody in that little clip said, well, why would they fake this? So here's the crazy part. Well, it's all crazy, but the Jesus that you are sold never lived and is a continuation of sun worship. Now, I'm not alone in saying that, but I want you to know, like, there is no man named Jesus. However, Jesus did exist and did every miracle and died on a cross. So, how was that possible? How is Christianity a false con job? There was no Jesus. Yet Jesus was very real, did everything they said, and none of it means what you think it does. And nobody wants to hear that, so it's like I can literally just, I'm just going to speak to myself. And here's the craziest part. I told you every man is a country. country is Jesus. And I'm going to do no further explanations today. I'm just going to lay it down, walk away, turn this off. But if you're smart, you'll think this through. Just a little bit at a time. And suddenly, if you understand how to do this, every answer for everything will come to you. It's like Randall Carlson said, once you see enough of the letters, it's obvious. But until you get any of them, it's a mystery. Because Jesus spoke in parables so that you wouldn't understand. But since you've all read the Bible, then you know there's a part in the Gospels where Jesus comes, and one of the times he's seen after the resurrection, and he says to his disciples how he showed them how to read the Gospels. Which means currently you don't know how to read the Gospels. And had you read the Bible, you would have thought, well, what is Jesus really saying? How do you really read the Gospels? How does any of this work? If you were at least trying, you could come to a mushroom thing, because the truth of the matter is that Jesus, the con Jesus, is literally mushrooms, right? There's a psychedelic form of religion, but Jesus is not religion. Jesus is not religion. Jesus is not Christianity. Jesus is above Christianity, and Christianity is stealing Jesus' identity to hide his true meaning so that you never figure it out and do the right thing. And what's the right thing? We'll get to that. But I'll just leave you with this. Jesus is Germany.